I am Nicholas Bornoz of Capital Inc., and I would like to welcome you all to today's forum. This is our second decarbonization forum, and we have a great agenda. We are starting the first day of our forum with the topic of alternative fuels. Alternative fuels is clearly one of the key considerations in the path to decarbonization. I will turn the floor over to Mr. George Plevrakis of ABS. George is Vice President for Global Sustainability for ABS, and then I will kindly ask George to welcome our distinguished speakers. Thank you all for joining, and thank you, George, and the panelists for being with us.
Thank you, Nicholas, for honoring us again with an invitation. Again, in way of introduction, I'm Georgios Plevrakis, Vice President of Global Sustainability for the American Bureau of Shipping. As I said earlier, I have the great honor of being your host for this panel in the context of the always insightful and thought-provoking Capital Link events. This panel discussion will bring together industry leaders representing organizations with pioneering decarbonization activities. Organizations that explore different fuel pathways from methanol to biofuels, LNG to hydrogen and ammonia. We will analyze the fuel options that exist to achieve IMO's 2030 and 2050 greenhouse gas targets. And our panelists will provide their unique perspective on the challenges and opportunities related to the adoption, scaling up, required infrastructure, challenges, opportunities, as well as how the fuel options are evolving. Needless to say, how humbled I am looking at the background of our panelists, and I will go straight away by welcoming them and introducing them one by one, being again cautious and fully aware of the fact that this is a very interesting discussion and deserves the time allocated to it. So, starting from Ms. Charis Plakantonaki, Chief Strategy Officer of Starbuck Carriers, welcoming you on board. Good evening, Ms. Plakantonaki, welcome on board. Mr. Mark Cameron, Chief Operating Officer at Ardmore Shipping, welcome to our panel, looking forward for the discussion. Mr. Mano, Director and Founder of MSea Capital, Mr. Mano, welcome on board. And Mr. Darr, Executive Vice President, Maritime Policy and Government Affairs of the MSea Group. Welcome aboard. Pleasure having you. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that this is a very interesting discussion when we always discuss about fuels. The discussion develops arms, legs, tails, heads, whatever. So we'll go straight to the chase. I will start by the individual that I introduced last in the list, by Mr. Darr. We see that there is a global competition for LNG is spiking prices. And that means that many of the LNG dual fuel vessels delivered will be burning MGO or HFO for the foreseeable future. How do you see the cost of alternative fuels impacting strategic decisions?
Well, first of all, let me say it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you. When it comes to alternative fuels, I think any of them, we had the expectation were going to be significantly more expensive than the cost that we're used to paying for fuel. So we should keep in mind, when we think about costs in the future, it won't just be the cost of production and delivery through a midstream that's still got to be built yet. And those of us involved in LNG know you're kind of paying for the infrastructure as you go. That may be the case with these other fuels too. So it's important when we think about costs, we don't think about the commodity cost, but we think about the delivered cost. Now, this transient in LNG prices in the marketplace has certainly had an impact, but I think we can look for, over time, those markets to normalize somewhat again back into a more natural state. And also, I do think that as we see external costs be brought in through the form of regulation, one way or the other, and that could take the form of imposition of a carbon price through one or more market-based measures. We certainly know one major one is coming in the EU at this point, probably starting in next year as we anticipate. All of those things, I think, will ultimately work to bridge the gap between the fuels we're using regularly today and those we're using tomorrow. Something interesting, happened with this transient in LNG prices in the marketplace, and that is the actual cost to the producers of bio-LNG became much more competitive with the fossil LNG, which was in the market. And I think that's a bit of an eye-opener for all of us as to what is possible when you look at volatility, not only in the natural marketplace, but what gets imposed from the outside. But I think we're going to see an increase in the range of, say, 2 to 8 times what we've customarily paid for fuel. And we need to anticipate that. We need to anticipate how we're going to distribute that throughout the value chain, or else we don't have a business to look after in the long term and a service to provide. But I do think there'll be costs that ultimately will be absorbed as other costs have been along the way. It just, everybody's got to be prepared for that, especially our customers, and they need to be realistic about it.
Excellent points, and I do note the points about the transient nature and the fact that there are also schemes and regulations that might bridge some gaps. I also liked your point on the bio-LNG and the fact that there was some significant developments there, and it shows that carbon neutral fuels might also be coming into our mix sooner than later. On that note, and because there has been a great discussion about how alternative fuels will be introduced in our fuel mix, particularly zero carbon fuels. And I'd like to turn to Ms. Plakantonaki. How do we see ammonia, particularly the green shades of that fuel? Do you see green ammonia being able to make a significant contribution to shipping's emissions by 2030, or even beyond that onwards to 2040?
Thank you, Georgios. It is great to be here today. Hello, everyone. Green ammonia is of course attractive because it is a zero emission fuel, and also because it does not require carbon for its production. Now, why is this good? This is good because it can ensure scalability in the production of this specific fuel, and also it can make sure that it is cost competitive in the long run, especially if we also see other industries using it as an alternative fuel. Another positive of ammonia is that today it's already shipped in large volumes as a cargo. We already have existing infrastructure, for example, in West Australia. Now, having said that, the large drawback for ammonia is its toxicity. So ammonia is highly toxic, and in that respect, it's critical that we do see safety standards moving forward in terms of its handling and storage, whether on board, but also in ports and in bunkering hubs. And we all know by now in shipping, but also in other industries, that safety comes first. So it is imperative that we have the safety standards in place before we're able to proceed with using ammonia as a fuel. Also, there isn't any ammonia engine at the moment, an internal combustion engine that is able to burn ammonia. It's not commercially available yet. We know that there are projects currently underway, so we also need to see developments on that front. Now, as to the supply and demand for green ammonia, Starbuck is participating in an iron ore consortium along with miners such as BHP and Rio Tinto, but also the shipping company Oldendorff. And within the context of that project, we're not looking at the technical or safety aspects of ammonia, but we are trying to analyze the supply and demand, as you mentioned, Georgios, up to 2030, 2040, even 2050, but also what would be the necessary agreements, commercial agreements, in order to be able to pass on the additional cost that will come up regards to ammonia. We do see as necessary the involvement of governments in bridging the competitiveness gap between conventional fuels and zero-emission fuels. Therefore, within the scope of that project, we will also try to engage governments in order to determine what are the necessary policy mechanisms in order to be in a position to make green ammonia cost competitive. Thank you.
No, thank you, Ms. Plakantonaki. Very insightful, particularly your comments about the production value chain aspects of ammonia and the possibilities of scalability and the cost effectiveness, but also the emphasis on the safety aspects that need to be clarified, and of course the technology maturity that needs to be in place so that we can see ammonia as part of the fuel mix. Now, we shifted from a fuel that has already been kind of mature and used in the industry when we discussed with Mr. Darr the LNG part. Then we attempted a forward look at the mid to long term with ammonia and Ms. Plakantonaki's points. I'd like to bring us a bit closer to the short term and the more mature solutions by looking at the potential of methanol. And I turn to Mr. Mano. Are we witnessing the rise of methanol as fuel? Is it too daring to say that there is a significant interest in methanol as fuel? And is it claiming its share, like LNG did, as a fuel of choice for those looking to reduce CO2 emissions today?
Thank you, George. Thank you, everyone, for having me on the panel. You started saying we're getting closer to something more mature. I would say, yes, possibly getting closer to the ground as well. We at MSea Capital, of course, we're great believers in methanol. Over a year ago, we set up a joint venture called Clean Sea Transport, where we heavily invested in methanol dual fuel product tankers, in cooperation, in partnership, in fact, with Methanex, which is the world's largest producer, and we intend to continue doing so. Now, you say the rise and the renaissance of methanol. I think if you go back to 2010, 2012, that's where perhaps, that was perhaps the turning point. Our company has already taken delivery of dual fuel methanol tankers in 2016, and then again in 2019, and recently in 2021, the third generation already of methanol powered vessels. And I think, what we like about it and what we think could basically secure its place in the future of decarbonization, it's first of all, its simplicity, its availability. Unlike some of the alternatives, it's liquid at ambient temperature. I think the capex of actually building, dual fuel in terms of the engine components and the fuel system components is more competitive than any other available alternative fuel at the moment. As we said, it's quite safe. You handle it like a liquid, like the normal bunkers we're used to. And one of the things that stopped us from, stopped this perhaps from developing further in the past, was of course the availability as a bunker fuel. This is something we're working on and it's going to develop in the future, and also its pricing. And interesting enough, over the past few months, we've seen, on the one hand, LNG prices going up quite significantly. Of course, the HFO, the conventional bunker fuel price is going up significantly, and methanol, on the other hand, becoming more and more competitive. At this point in time, as a matter of fact, methanol as a fuel is just slightly more competitive, or at par more or less with VLSFO, and even cheaper than low sulfur gas oil. And that's not always been the case. And of course, no one can guarantee that this will be the case in the future, but I think it does demonstrate that pricing dynamics, they do change quite dramatically. And there are times where we can see an alternative fuel, a cleaner fuel, and that actually has also pricing advantages. Now, the other thing that we really like about it when we talk into the future is the ability of the transition in methanol production, kind of developing hand in hand with the transition of, the clean shipping, the whole decarbonization process. So the methanol we're all looking at and working and burning today is in fact gray methanol, and that does not offer dramatic savings in emissions. It's about 15% on a well to wake, but it's it's nowhere where we could, when people talk about green hydrogen or green ammonia or even green methanol, we're not there yet. But the great thing about it is that the methanol is ultimately going to be the same methanol. So as we now burn, as a matter of fact, we actually burn now methanol. We have over 40,000 hours of engine running hours on methanol already, just us as a company. So we see that we can burn the gray now. It can become blue as blue becomes more available, globally, and blue methanol production is actually happening. And as green methanol production is also taking place, in significant scale and becomes more competitive, you can use the same ship, same engine, same fuel system, to burn that. So it actually gives you the path into 2030, 2040, 2050, and beyond, of course. So whereas we've seen LNG was definitely kind of the favorite solution, I think up until recently, and will continue to be. We don't think there's going to be one single winner here or one single alternative fuel, of course. But that's also the fact that it's, people are more familiar with it. It's been much more widely available. We've had LNG carriers burning, LNG for many, many, many years now. So I think the natural inclination was, let's build a ship that can also burn LNG. We already have the engines. But again, I think as we see also in the order book now, we've had over 40 dual fuel methanol vessels ordered just over the past 12 months, up from a handful, 10 or 5 or 10 the year before. So I think it's quite a dramatic change, and I think it's definitely gaining ground and will hold ground as this process develops.
Interesting points, and the points that you raised with regards to how a methanol ship could actually follow a decarbonization trajectory by introducing carbon neutral molecules is an interesting one, and it's a good segue to my next question. And I'd like to turn to Mr. Cameron. Can we move forward as an industry without this well-to-wake perspective? What are your thoughts about it? And there are discussions now. There are proposals that submitted to the IMO through the MEPCs. What is missing, and what do we need with regards to carbon neutrality and life cycle approach so that we can have this type of solutions? What are your thoughts about well-to-wake?
Great, thanks, George, and thanks for the invite for being here. Let me come to that. I just want to pick up, if I can, on a couple of points that were made before. And I think contextually, I think it's important to remember that we've had almost the luxury as an industry of being, the waste product user. So we've had a bit of an artificial ride when it comes to the cost of bunkers since, we've moved away from coal. So, by being an end, sort of bottom of the pile user, we're now being brought into the mainstream of the world by using clean fuels. And this is a challenge that, we're not facing alone. And I sometimes think that we can segment our industry out into its own little neat package and try and solve the problem for ourselves without thinking in the broader context that the solutions we're talking about, many other industries, in fact, countries, are looking at the problems in the same way. So let's not isolate ourselves to just thinking this is a shipping problem. I think land-based competition for fuel sources is absolutely going to be, one of the big considerations that we haven't had to think about before. So when we're talking about, what angle are we going to take as an industry, we've also got to be looking at where are those fuel types and resources going to be used in much more proliferation in terms of volumes. And of course, that's definitely going to be in the land-based industries. I think in terms of ammonia, we run the risk of oversimplifying certain parts of this. And I certainly have no intention to discredit any of the fuels that we're talking about here, because we can't afford to. But let's be honest about ammonia. We can't engineer out toxicity. We can do many other things around fuels and our ability to transport them, to burn them, but you can never engineer out toxicity. And that's one of the biggest questions that I think sometimes in these conversations, we tend to package away and say, you know, it's okay, we'll get to that when we can. Let's also not forget that pilot fuel in many of these solutions is a consideration. And we have to be honest with ourselves about that and say, you know, when we're talking about alternative fuels, it's a trajectory and we're going to move over time in this direction. So having a pilot fuel introduced together with methanol and ammonia is a reality. And that's okay, right? Because it's not, you know, as if we're talking about a dirty word here. I really think that some of the challenges we're talking about are always end state instead of saying, where can we start? And Modi's got some great examples there that he was talking about his reality, and Bud as well, and Charis. But I also think that sometimes starting with generators and just replacing a diesel generator right now with an alternative type of fuel product, smaller amounts need to be carried on board. There can be easier trials performed that aren't related to main engines. So that's a very important thing just to consider, the importance of a diesel generator being replaced right now. So to your question about, you know, kind of well to wake, I think no doubt there has to be a well to wake consideration in this, because that's the way every other industry and every other country is going to be facing the same challenge. So if you take that argument away and just consider it with tank to wake or something, I think we're really fooling ourselves in the whole equation. And I come back to what I said right at the beginning. This is a much bigger question than just what shipping is facing alone. We have to be looking at the alternative sources and the competitive alternative sources that land-based use is going to be looking at. So if we're not all measured by the same standards in terms of production, then we're just isolating shipping into a false environment that may give us some immediate comfort, but not actually serve the bigger purpose.
Thank you so much. I'd also like to have Mr. Darr's opinion on the well to wake and what is required. Standardization, a universal approach. Do we have it? How far are we from that? And what is it? What is required for these carbon neutral molecules to arrive at our ships?
Yeah, thank you, George. I'd just like to start by saying, Mark, well done. I think all of your comments really resonate with me, and I'd like to associate myself with every comment Mark just made. I thought they were really spot on. I'll add on to that and say that when I look at the value in a well-to-wake approach, I think there's, you know, two things that come to mind. One is that we need as many fuel options as we can realistically get at volume. And as Mark pointed out, and I'll maybe add a little more specificity on it, you know, this is the most 2 to 3%, most important 2 to 3% of the emissions profile in the planet to us, right? But if you look at the overall energy markets, you know, we're a relatively small part of it. We're not going to drive the large scale production and delivery of the fuels. So we need to be realistic about where can we catch a ride off of some of these other users. And they are looking at the well to wake approach. So I think if you limit yourself to tank to wake, I think Mark's right. You end up in this false, you know, set of assumptions about how well you're really doing if you only look at what comes out of the stack rather than what went into production of the fuel. The second point I'll make about a well-to-wake approach is you can't get the benefit of, say, production of an e-methanol or production of an e-methane on the upstream side of the life cycle unless you're willing to accept the regulatory burden of the upstream portion of the life cycle. You can't have it both ways. And in my opinion, and we don't take quite as optimistic of a view of the tank to wake approach with gray methanol today as perhaps Modi's experience would say they've had. And we don't have that level of experience he's had, but we don't hold out a 15% tank to wake benefit right now for greenhouse gases overall, but it doesn't matter whether it's zero, and we tend to think it's something more like about equal if you look at the entire life cycle for gray methanol to be used right now. We need methanol in the fuel mix, and the way you get from that sort of a profile where you're breaking even or maybe making 15% against the benchmark that you're trying to achieve in decarbonization is on the upstream. So, you know, we've got to get credit for that production through a bio or a synthesized method in order to make that all fit together and have these fuels available. Otherwise, we just won't have enough options at volume to what we really need. And if you look at what has to happen for ammonia, and like Mark, I'm not criticizing any of these fuels. I see all of them having a role for us, and we're making investments, I want to be very clear, that accommodate all of them for the future. And that's part of our thinking and how this future will look for us. But if you look at ammonia, what has to happen, there is, you know, to supply e-ammonia for shipping alone, you need basically the renewable power supply that's available on the planet today as a starting point. Then you have to produce green hydrogen through electrolyzers, which don't exist yet. And then you have to get enough of that hydrogen diverted towards what we need rather than the other users. And then there's more power needed and a catalyst process to actually create the green ammonia to then be transported through a non-existent midstream right now to get to where it's actually needed on the ship, where there are a significant amount of safety issues that need to be resolved. And we do have to figure out how we're going to deal with this pilot fuel issue. It is significant, as Mark said. It's depending on which OEM you talk to, you might get an estimate between 5 to 30% pilot fuel that's needed. And what that pilot fuel is and where it comes from and how you have to store it really has a big impact on the analysis. So I'm an optimist on this. I really think we're going to get there. It's just, it shouldn't be oversimplified into sound bites or ideology. It should really follow hard work and science and technological growth.
All good and valid points, Mr. Darr. We have been discussing a lot about the dynamics of this landscape of fuels that is in development right now. I'd like to turn to Ms. Plakantonaki and change a bit the perspective, or change a bit our gears. There's a lot of discussion about how a net zero future would look like. And when we're discussing about fuels, there is a debate on whether we should include in that fuel spectrum nuclear solutions as well. There is a debate on whether we should consider them a technology or an energy source or a fueling source. Is a net zero dream a nuclear dream? And is it something that you see happening, considering in your company in the midterm or long term?
Thank you, Georgios. Indeed, a very interesting question, as there's a lot of debate concerning nuclear power. Now, nuclear power in the maritime industry is not something new, and it does have the potential to contribute to our industry's 2050 target in the sense that it is net zero. Although there is a very high capital expenditure involved when it comes to nuclear propulsion, the operating expenses are expected to be low because it is said that onboard reactors would require refueling only every few years. Now, leaving the financial side of nuclear power aside, the major barrier when it comes to nuclear power is, of course, the public's perception on whether nuclear propulsion is something safe. And same as with ammonia that we talked about before, again, safety comes first. Especially in shipping, where we have issues such as corrosion, vibration, etc., reactors for marine propulsion would need to be extremely trustworthy. Therefore, it is important that we do see maritime safety standards being developed for all green fuels, including nuclear power. We're going to be considering it for marine use. Otherwise, we're not in a position to assess their technical and economic feasibility. Now, if the safety aspect of nuclear is clarified in the coming years, of course, as a company, we would be open to consider it. Same as we're considering any green fuel in the market. We are fuel agnostic, so we're trying to do our homework on every possible solution that could contribute to shipping's decarbonization in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. So I see that there is a consensus that the fueling issue is a very complicated one in the sense that it has a lot of elements and criteria that need to be reviewed when decision making has to happen. That being said, we've discussed a lot about safety aspects, even security aspects. We discussed about economical aspects. Now, when we want to make a decision with regards to a decarbonization related action, fuel selection, what are the implications on a company from a company perspective? Looking at the broader narrative about ESG, will a particular decision on the decarbonization solutions define actions that go beyond the pure environmental activities? And I'd like to listen to Mr. Mano's view on that.
I think compliance and the regulations and the decarbonization process, of course, will potentially have dramatic effects on our strategic and commercial decisions. I think starting with the relatively easy bit, which is just compliance. I think if all of us just wanted to comply, that would be a fairly easy, target to achieve, and that would not result in dramatic changes, because just by virtue of having more economical engines today, and we would all be compliant for quite a few more years to come, and then we can start introducing different blends and fuels which just save a little bit. But I don't think that's what's ultimately driving it. I think there's a combination of things. Let's call it, some hard factors, which is financing and investors' perception. So are shareholders actually driving this, or will they be? Are shareholders, for example, happy to see slightly lower returns on their share, but invest in cleaner companies? I think the jury is still out. When it comes to raising, capital, I think unless this capital has been dedicated and raised up front for the purpose of investing, in ESG technologies, mostly people would still want to see a return first, and ESG and compliance as, I wouldn't say secondary, but alongside with it. Financing, I think quite clearly you would see that the banking system, the financial markets are gearing towards making cheaper capital available, whether it's through subsidies, government guarantees, or different other products and schemes which are available out there. So that is going to be a consideration for some companies. But I think the main effect is actually going to come from the customer, from the charterer in our case, and customer, and you see that's the self-regulated type of industry we are at the end of the day. And you see the Poseidon principles, and you see announcements from some other multinationals, companies like Unilever, and commodity trades and stuff like that. Ultimately, your customer wants to see a cleaner logistical solution for the transport of its commodity or its product, because his customer wants to see. And that's, that I think at the end of it boils down to our children who grow up in a different environment today, and they go to school and they get different education than perhaps we did, 20, 30, 40 years ago. I won't disclose. and then you see that their expectation is totally different. They really want to see cleaner products. It starts by the paper and the way they use they recycle stuff, and to the way they transport and how they view it, the first car they get when they're 18 or 20 years old. And that's driving it. And I think that's where we're going to be well beyond compliant. And I think that's why it's happening now. That's why it's happening in the big way. That's probably why you have, I think, something like 450 LNG dual fuel vessels on order and another 40 dual fuel methanol tankers, not because we need them today or tomorrow, because we're all in an environment in companies which at the end of the day want to be part of decarbonization. We understand the goal, our customers and our stakeholders understand the goal. So I think what's driving it is at the moment more that than actual compliance. Of course, you need the regulation, you need the directives, and I agree with you need the work-to-wake approach, of course, but a little bit like class. Class basically sets the minimum standard we all need to comply with. Most of shipping companies would want to be even better than that. And I think same for decarbonization. We would all need to comply, and every year compliance is going to get slightly, tougher, and requirements are going to be a bit stricter. But ultimately, most of us are going to want to be well ahead of that curve.
Excellent. I highly appreciate your comments on the social aspects of the drivers, as well as the role of class in the whole picture. Well noted. I will take us down to ground level now. Before we conclude, I'd like to ask Mr. Cameron one last question before we have a closing discussion on the broader decarbonization aspects. There is a discussion about using emission abatement technologies so that carbon-based fuels can continue to be used for the transition period. How do you see these type of technologies being implemented? Carbon capture, is it going to be indeed the game-changing technology that the industry is considering it?
I'm glad you're squeezing that in right at the end, because I think it's a vital part of the whole consideration. Fossil fuels are going to be around. Again, let's not kid ourselves here. Fossil fuels are going to be around because some very, very important targets to meet 25, 30, and 50. And I think those targets and timelines are only going to compress. They're not going to elongate. Anybody who thinks that's living in la la land. And rightfully so, those targets and timelines must come shorter. Carbon capture is going to be a reality of our time. Probably long before some of the other, things that we're talking about are really going to have mainstream operation. Let's not forget that the liner trades, the big container carriers like Bud represents, these are going to be the guys that set both the volumes and the fuel types in the locations. For Modi and myself, and I think Charis, who's out there, we're tramp trading. We're going to have a completely different profile of lifting, and we're going to rely on the big predictable drivers in this transition to start to say where the fuel types can be lifted and what is going to be available in those areas. Carbon capture for the rest of us is going to be an essential part. And even if you're talking about, as we talked about earlier with the pilot fuel types, capturing a bit of that carbon, and you don't have to capture everything, just a percentage of carbon. And we know there's complexities with it in terms of storing it on board, but it can be done. And these compact pieces of equipment that are coming out now really are going to be a game changer in terms of helping us meet those short-term trajectories. What's really important is what you do with the carbon, where the offtake facilities for it going to be on the ships. And I think certainly in the tanker trades, how is Ocimf going to respond in terms of helping us set those standards? How are we going to find vetting standards being applied uniformly by those people coming on our ships to evaluate them? And that applies to all of us. So I think that's vital. I'm conscious that time is running out, but I just wanted to make the point on the ESG side. It's great that so many of us who attend these panels and talk on these panels represent largely public companies or certainly well-financed companies. A lot of players in this industry are very small people, and they're subject to the vagaries of the market. The earnings potential can be boom or bust, as we know for so long. So I think shipping is still a cheap option for moving goods. Until we get some stability in pricing mechanisms, we're going to have to really just bite down hard to understand that when the going is good, we don't just put that money straight back into dividends. We plow it back into good, solid capital allocation policies that really look towards technology and future fuels as a part of that. And that's where ESG needs to come. in people's annual reports to really say what they're doing.
Thank you so much, Mr. Cameron. I did note your comments on carbon capturing technology. Now we are almost out of time. We have a couple of minutes left, and I will kindly ask you to attempt what it is normally a very difficult challenge, but to provide the audience with an elevator speech on whether our industry is on track to meet a net zero future for 2050, if this likelihood from a regulatory perspective is actually materialized. So I will start with Ms. Plakantonaki. What do you think? Are we there? Are we on track?
Thank you.
Can we do it?
So it's important to stress, and Bud made a reference to it earlier, that shipping is not alone in this effort. Other sectors who are much larger contributors to global warming will have to contribute to the technological advancements that are required to take us to 2050. Unfortunately, right now, the situation of the war, this is not helping. We may be seeing an increase in the use of coal instead of scaling it down as promised during COP26, but still the implications of climate change on humanity are huge. And because of that, public pressure is expected to drive the political will that will live up to the Paris Agreement goals. This will drive regulation, government spending, and incentives, which are necessary because public sector is not alone to pull this challenge off. So in a nutshell, I am optimistic that we will be seeing good progress on the 2050 trajectory. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mr. Darr, what are your views on this?
So I think our industry got a bit of a slow start. And I think that in fairness, even if you look back 12, 18, 24 months ago, there were some that were really dragging their heels on this. I think we're doing great now. I really think we've turned a huge corner. The industry as a whole supports net zero for 2050. Governments aren't ready for that yet. I wish they were. They need to catch up. We support carbon pricing on a global level and a market-based measure on a global level. Governments aren't there yet. They need to be. That's an essential part of making this work. Industry also supports massive injection of research and development. We've made a proposal which we would fund it. Governments weren't ready for that yet. If they weren't ready for that, they need to step up to the plate and they need to do it. The long pole in the tent for us here is not going to be us, because I do think you're starting to see the capital flow in the right places. You're starting to see the commitments we need and the ecosystem involving our customers coming together and aligning with this. But it's going to be, do we have the fuel? It doesn't do any good to have the ship if you don't have the fuel. And we're really good at a lot of things. We're not good at producing fuels and delivering fuels in an infrastructure that doesn't exist yet. That's got to happen by the energy providers with assistance of others to make this all come together. That's going to be the critical path. But I think we are on track. It took us a while to get on track, and we should stay there and remain very positive that we'll make it.
Another optimistic view. Thank you for that. Mr. Mano.
I think my view is quite optimistic too. I think if we're talking about the shipping industry, and that's the beauty about a highly competitive industry with a lot of creative people who need to survive. I mean, the industry is very inventive. It's creative, very responsive to reality and what has to be done, and resilient at the end of the day. So just again, as Bud said, look back at what has happened over the past 18 months. It's unbelievable compared to the rest of the world, compared to other sectors in the economic landscape. We already have charter party clauses which deal with cleaner fuels and transition fuels. We're talking about pricing, and we have pricing visibility, and we're talking about supply and how do we source the supply. And I totally agree with Bud. On that front, I mean, we're not going to become energy companies, or we don't intend to become at least energy companies and and manufacturing companies, but we're doing what we can within our network. So I personally believe in technology, and I think the technological solutions are gonna come. There's plenty of time to implement them. I believe in the social responsibility that each one of us has, and is driven by our shareholders, financiers, and families at the end of the day. I think that the capital will be found. It always ultimately gets found, and we're gonna basically divert the resources and put them in the right place. So it's real. It's happening. I think it's we don't talk. As an industry, I think we do.
Thank you, Mr. Mano. And final thoughts from Mr. Cameron.
I'll be quick because Nick's there to take us out. Don't forget the diesel generators. Don't forget that you can replace diesel generators. They're a significant contributor to the equation, and people seem to just focus on main engines. Right now, replace the diesel generator.
Valuable notes and ideas and thoughts there, and we are actually closing this with some really positive attitude. So, Mr. Bornozis, the floor is yours now. Thank you, everybody.
Well, I have the easy part because all I want to do is thank you for a great discussion, as expected, a terrific insight on a very critical topic. So, George, thank you for moderating. Charis, Mark, Bud, and Modi, thank you very much for being part of this great panel. And of course, this session will be available upon demand shortly for those who would like to access it online again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.